Hello, students. The purpose of this lecture is to help you get started on writing a literary paper, which may be a little bit different than the process that you've used to write other kinds of papers. And so before we get started, I wanted to outline for you the purposes of writing a paper. I understand that writing a paper is not something most students tend to be enthusiastic about but it is a very important exercise for two reasons. One is that through the close study of a work, and this close study is key, it shows that you're really engaging with it and thinking about it for yourself. So that experience is part of the reason I make you write these papers, because it forces you to look closely at these words and not just listen to what I say, but come up with your own thoughts about it. So through that process, you do two things. One, you probably see something you hadn't noticed before. You learn something new. And the purpose of the paper is to share, like, hey, I noticed this thing that you might not have noticed without the kind of careful study that I did. So you learn something new, and you also can substantiate your opinions about it. So when there are legitimate questions where people can disagree, you learn how to present your own perspective and back it up with the kind of textual detail and evidence that will make it persuasive. So that's sort of the content piece of writing a paper. And that is, in essence, what you'll be graded on in terms of content. Have you really looked carefully at the text? Are you pointing out something that's the fruit of serious study and that you might not have noticed otherwise? Are you backing up the things you have to say, or are you just sort of talking about your own thoughts about it without ever really mentioning or quoting the text in front of you? That's the content piece. The second part is how it's expressed. It should be this opinion you found, this description of something new that you found should be expressed clearly, coherently, and even elegantly. And I know that sounds like a tall order, especially for those of you who are sort of at the beginning of your high school careers, but that really is the ultimate goal. The best literary criticism is actually a work of literature in its own right. It is also beautiful, and neither you nor I are at that level of attainment right now, but that is sort of the final form towards which we should all be heading. So that's the writing and composition part of your paper, and that's the part we work on a little bit later, a little bit down the road, expressing your ideas more clearly, saying them in the most elegant and beautiful and clear way that you possibly can, and of course getting rid of, things like grammar errors and making sure it's typed up so everybody can read it. All that sort of good stuff comes down the road, but that's why you're also graded on that element of your papers.
The first question to deal with is, of course, what is a thesis statement? And a thesis statement is most essentially a sentence or two that answers the question that's asked in the essay prompt. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to answer absolutely every question in the prompt in your thesis statement. That would make for an extremely complicated sentence, because a lot of times your essay prompt is going to have several questions that are trying to guide you and push you towards things that you should consider or include in your paper. But it should answer the main question. Now, you also shouldn't just restate the question. You don't want to use the same words and phrases over again, because that just makes it sound like you're answering a question on a test, and that's not really what you want to do in an essay. You're presenting your own thoughts on this topic. A thesis also has to make an arguable claim. Making a claim means that someone could potentially disagree with you, and they could make a viable argument to defend that position. You have to be able to imagine somebody coming up with a different version of events or a different interpretation than your own. This means that there aren't just statements about the plot or something like that. That is not a good thesis statement. And finally, a good thesis statement includes a roadmap of your essay. And what this means is that your thesis has embedded in it a hint to your readers of the organizational structure you have in mind. This doesn't necessarily mean you lay out all of the arguments you're going to make, or you include a phrase referencing every paragraph in your paper. But there should be some kind of preparation for your readers so that they know the basic way you're going to approach this topic. So, to give you
So for the sample we're going to work through today to sort of show you what the process would look like, what I've chosen is a possible essay prompt for something we haven't read, but a related work, which is the play Agamemnon, which contains that story of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra that we've seen referred to so many times in the Odyssey. And you'll notice that this prompt has a lot of different questions in it, and they're all sort of versions, variations on the same idea to sort of get you thinking in a couple different ways. So here's the core question. What is the function of the imagery of birds in Agamemnon? Okay. Here's some more questions to sort of, because often if you leave it there, students just sort of look at you blankly. So here's some more questions to sort of help get you thinking along the right paths. Which birds are associated with which characters, and what is the author trying to convey through those associations? How do the different kinds of birds compare with each other? So now what you might be thinking is that, okay, I have this question, I need to come up with an answer for that. That's my first step, to come up with an answer, or at least an idea for an answer. That's actually backwards. What you need to do first is say, okay, well, what kinds of information do I need from the text in order to answer the question, and find that first. So in this case, we're going to go hunting for imagery of birds and see what we find. You don't have to have a complete answer to the question before you start writing your paper. In fact, you shouldn't. The whole point of this is to make you dive into the text and learn from it. So that is where you should start with finding your evidence. So that's where we're going to go in Agamemnon. And this might not make 100% sense to you because it's not something you've read, but I still think you can follow along with the evidence we're going to look at next.
Let's take a look at that vulture image. It portrays Agamemnon and Menelaus as conquerors, but that image also introduces the idea of revenge as what motivates those vultures, and it's revenge that will destroy them, or at least Agamemnon. The image of the eagle who captures the pregnant hare. It's an omen of their victory. It indicates that they're going to be the winners at Troy. This is good news. But that omen, that destruction of the pregnant hare, also makes Artemis, who's the goddess of the hunt and the protector of hunted animals, angry because of the needless slaughter of the hare's babies. And it's that the anger of Artemis that necessitates the sacrifice of Iphigenia, which it could be argued precipitates Agamemnon's downfall. So it's got both the victory in it and it's got the doom in it at the same time. And then we can look at the images of Cassandra with her swallow and her nightingale. They're images of helplessness and fear. These are not the same kinds of birds as what we've just been talking about, vultures and eagles. But there's also a power in the beauty of her song and her ability to see the future. Unlike Agamemnon, who is blind, even in spite of hints to what is happening to him, Cassandra has sight, which is something that everyone else in the play is lacking. So what ties all of these bird images together is the union of both strength and weakness together.
So now that we've noticed these things, now that we have that evidence, now is the time to develop that working thesis. And of course, since the main point of a thesis is to answer the question, I have reprinted the question here. What is the function of the imagery of birds in Agamemnon? Let's look at some possible things we might come up with when we're looking for a thesis statement. Aeschylus uses many different kinds of imagery in Agamemnon, including many images of birds. Now, this is a very common type of early thesis statement I get. And it's common because people don't follow the process that I have suggested here. They start with the thesis. And what you might notice about this is that it contains no actual information that isn't already in the question. It tells me that there's imagery, and there's imagery with birds. This is true, but it's also the information that was already in the question. So if you start out without looking at the text first, you're going to come up with a thesis statement like this, and I'm going to tell you to do it again because you're not telling me anything I didn't already say for you. So that's not any good. Aeschylus was a close observer of birds because he used many details about them in his play. This may indeed have been true. However, it is irrelevant to the question at hand. The bird-watching habits of ancient Greek playwrights do not help us understand the function of the imagery of birds inside the play. So the problem with this thesis statement is that it doesn't actually answer the question. Here's another possibility. Images of birds are sometimes used as an omen of the future in Agamemnon. This one is starting to get somewhere. It's starting to get towards, okay, well, what's the function of imagery? It tells us something about the future, and that people find out stuff about the future based on what birds do. So we're on our way towards an answer to the question, which is good. However, we're really only halfway there because this isn't actually an arguable point. It is undoubtedly true that birds are sometimes used as an omen of the future. It happens in the Odyssey. It happens in all of the ancient Greek works because it was just something they did. What kind of bird it was, where it flew, all of these were considered omens, and it was the job of, the soothsayers and the prophets to interpret what they meant. So this is not an arguable point. Therefore, it needs something sort of added onto it in order to make it a complete thesis statement. Now, here is sort of our final variation. In Agamemnon, bird imagery is sometimes associated with innocence and sometimes with viciousness. Okay, this first sentence is a little bit like the previous one in that it's kind of getting at the idea of function, but by itself, it's not making an arguable point. So what we have is this second sentence that adds on, okay, so here's why that's important. And that is where you're trying to persuade somebody of something. This is where you're making an arguable claim. Aeschylus uses the same type of image for both of these characters because it shows that they all cannot escape fate. So that second piece is kind of necessary to make this a complete working thesis. Now, I keep saying it's a working thesis, and that's because it will almost certainly change. Through the process of writing your paper, putting your thoughts out there in print helps develop them. So you can and you should come back to your thesis and refine it, both for what it contains and, of course, for style and things like that. But this is a place to start. You have this idea that you can now work with as you start to write your paper, and you can move on to the working outline, which is what comes next.
Working thesis, we need a working outline. Now, when I say a working thesis and a working outline, these will change as you write your paper. Your thesis will definitely change. Your outline will definitely change. This gives you a place to start from. If you just sit down with a blank piece of paper and try to start writing paragraphs, it's going to be a mess, I promise. You need a place to start so that there's something to pin your thoughts to, so you have something to talk about as you get going. Okay,